The same has been true in the West, in Britain, United States. It's only in the past 5 years that the problems have become clearer. Because, of course, platforms offer themselves as convenient. They are offering us ways of connecting. Everyone likes to connect. Connecting is good. But that does not mean that connecting on these terms is good for us in the long run. That is the question. Can we renegotiate different terms of connection in the future, for the future? And that is why now in the West, in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Brazil, America, these debates have been starting in the past 2 or 3 years. On Monday, I did a talk with people in Bangladesh about these same issues. So the whole world is turning to think about these issues right now. But it is important to be clear that there are sometimes benefits of connection. But that does not mean to say we have to give up our freedom and the space of our lives in order for convenience. That's a big trade-off we need to think very seriously about as human beings and talk about that together as human beings. Because let's start by saying everyone understands the convenience. I have a smartphone. I use WhatsApp to speak to my family and so on. I understand the convenience. If you have children, it's even more important to make life easy and convenient. So we understand that, but at the same time, we have to understand what is happening through this convenience. Let me tell a different story. Imagine tomorrow I say to you, I am going to make your life much easier. I am going to install cameras throughout your house, throughout your apartment, which I can see. And every time you need food, I'm going to bring you the food. Every time something needs changing in your house, I will automatically change it. The only problem is I have to watch you the whole time. Now, this would be very convenient. I would never need to worry ever again about food or anything. Everything will be arranged by this outside person. Would we say yes to that? We wouldn't. Because to say yes to that will be to give up the freedom of our house, our space, our life. No human being ever does that. But this is what as someone says in the chat, it sounds like Black Mirror, because Black Mirror has been very good in predicting the direction of the thinking of the corporations. To give you one example, which came out as we were finishing the book, after the speech, which you heard me give just now, in the Harvard Business Review, May 2019, there was an article called The Age of Continuous Connection by 2 senior marketers from the Wharton Business School in University of Pennsylvania. And they argued that marketing needs to change. Marketing is too slow because it only follows us up to the moment when we buy the car or the phone or the refrigerator. Why don't marketers follow people when they use the phone or the car or the refrigerator? Then they would have complete knowledge of the consumer. And this is what they propose, the age of continuous connection, where every time I use something, take milk out of my fridge, put it back in, take food out, it will be noted by my fridge. And when I need more food, it will automatically be ordered and it will arrive. This is the future of marketing. So these are serious plans of marketers in the West right now. And we need to see that this is what is actually being thought about by marketers. Let me imagine one other thing in the story, and then I will stop talking. Suppose the second thing that happened was I offered you this convenience. I bring everything to your house. You never need to do anything again. Supposing 2 days later, but I don't tell you this, I do a deal with the state to pass on some of that information I know about you to the government, or maybe to another corporation that does a secret deal with the government. Then you will be even more unhappy. But this is really what is happening with corporations. Not all, Apple take a different view, but this is what is happening with many corporations. I've just told in a very simple story, like a fairy tale, the story of what's happened in the past 10 or 15 years in our societies and what is happening now in Vietnam too. And that, I think, is why Dr. Giang is absolutely right, and Dr. Dang too, that we have to take seriously the story of what is actually happening in our societies, because it is being hidden from us. This is complicated, so this is a good question, and it's right to go slowly at this point. What we're saying is, first, that data colonialism, the grabbing of our data for capitalism, comes out of capitalism. It's part of the development of capitalism. Without capitalism, we wouldn't have mobile phones. We wouldn't have the advanced economies that we do. We wouldn't have the market structures that we do. But then we need to think, where did capitalism come from? And the historians of capitalism, first of all, argue you could not have capitalism without the transformation of society. You can't have market relations without changing social life to be organized around markets, around selling things. And this is what the great economic historian Karl Polanyi argued in his book about where does capitalism come from. Then Marx argued that capitalism is sustained in the future through social relations, labor relations, through selling your job, your work on the market. We're arguing this is now means selling your data on the market. But then we have to go back one stage further, is where do these transformations come from? And they came from the origins of colonialism. So the way we're seeing colonialism is worth explaining. We are trying to get to the core of colonialism. Colonialism was a terrible thing. It involved extreme racism, extreme violence, forms of government which were really bad, and it's good that they're finished. But the core of colonialism was the taking of assets, the taking of land, the taking of bodies. At the beginning of colonialism, it was the taking of gold and silver in Latin America by Spain and Portugal. It's the taking of the resources that is the key thing, right? And what we're saying is that right now there's a new resource in life being taken, and the resource is us. And that's why we say we're not just in a continuation of capitalism. Of course we are. We're in something deeper, which is a new historical era beginning, the taking of a new resource, grabbing us, which will form the preparation for a new capitalism 20, 30, maybe 100 years in the future. But if we don't act now, it will happen without our resistance. And that's why I mentioned the great German author, W.G. Siebold, at the end of my speech, which was given in Germany, a silent catastrophe that goes unperceived. And can I just remember us of one very sad thing about the very beginning of colonialism in Latin America? When the colonialists came, often the colonized populations gave them gifts. They gave them nice things because they thought they meant well. They thought they were going to give convenience, a better life. We know what happened. I think there are two levels to this. In the general level, the victim is humanity in general. Because if the story I told you is right, and there are many comments in the chat about the convenience of our phones and data being collected from us, I understand all that. But I've told you that something else may be happening at the same time. And if we see it through that story, we realize that human freedom may be at stake here for the longer term. So humanity in general suffers from that. If all of us live lives where we are constantly being monitored, where data can be used against us in the future in ways we don't understand, and so on, this is a cost for humanity. But at the same time, it's very important to emphasize that these techniques of gathering data are really, in effect, ways of governing people. What we're looking at today is a new way of governing society and governing the economy through data. Very often being governed feels convenient. It's more convenient than chaos, that's for sure. It's more convenient than war. As you know very well in Vietnam, it's more convenient. But that does not mean to say that there are not costs in how we are governed and that we don't need to ask questions when we are being governed in a new way, for example, through data. And this is important, for example, in the area of personal finance. I don't know if this is important yet in Vietnam, but in the United States, there is a very large market for giving personal loans, often through social media platforms. This is happening in China too, through Alibaba, is where people get personal loans to enable them to buy food and clothes and houses and everything. All these markets are now being dominated by data gathering, data monitoring, not just at the moment when you need the loan, but throughout your life as a consumer. And then the issue is, how is that data being used? Is it being used to help the poor person who needs support because they are at the bottom of society? Is it being used to help them? No, it's being used on a market basis. As I said in the lecture, it's being used to make profit for the company offering the loan and the company controlling the data. And there's a lot of evidence in the United States and Britain that these new loan markets based around data are much harsher to poor people than the previous system, which still believed that poor people need help because we need more equality in society. Data markets are not about equality. They're about reinforcing inequality to make profit. And that means that the costs in the long run of data colonialism are for everyone, but also most particularly for those who are already poor and weak, which also in America, for example, means those who suffered from historic colonialism, Black populations, Latino populations, women without husbands, but having children, and so on. So the history of colonialism and the history of capitalism continue through this new force of data colonialism. So some people will suffer much more than others, but everyone, humanity as a whole, is also going to be damaged by this. So that's a double answer, Dr. Locke, but I hope that answers your question. Add to that very important point. This goes back to the question that we asked before in the audience. If data is so convenient, what is the problem? Surely we need convenience. And as Dr. Zhang said just then, if you are, let's say, cleaning people's houses or doing work in a hospital or doing work with sick old people, you need work. You don't have a good job with secure income. You have to take each job as it comes, normally through an app on your phone. This is the way this works. Okay, so a person in that situation won't want to listen to say, don't be part of data colonialism, because their survival depends on being part of data colonialism. But why is that? That's because a social order is being built on their connection. That's why there's no choice. But what is the price of this deal that's being done with people? It is that they will, as Dr. Zhang very vividly said, they will work without limits. They can receive a job at any time in the night. They will need to be connected without any limits. Whether they need to sleep or not, they must still be connected, the phone switched on, which means they have total dependence on the infrastructure of connection, which means inevitably, as whenever you are dependent on something, you are vulnerable to it being taken away. And that means you are totally vulnerable to being exploited through the infrastructure of connection. And this is what Virginia Eubanks writes about in her very powerful American book, Automating Inequality. That this new system of governing human beings through data seems convenient, especially for those who are rich already. But it brings massive costs for those who are not rich, who are vulnerable. It increases their vulnerability. It is not fun. This is a new way of governing society. And that, as Dr. Zhang says, and Dr. Dang as well, that affects those who are already most vulnerable most. So we have to think about that. Yes, I understand. You mean debt bondage, vulnerability to debt. Yes. Yes. There is a general connection. As I said just before, the way that the debt markets are now working in the US, especially more than in Britain, maybe more than in Vietnam, but in America very strongly already, debt markets are based around continuous surveillance of consumers and their families, tracking their behavior to see whether they have a high value as someone to be in debt. People are encouraged to be in more debt because money is made out of debt. People are encouraged to give more data because that helps the servicing of the debt, and it also helps those who make money from the data. So everyone is encouraged to be more and more part of this debt market. So that is part of data colonialism. But I think your question implied it's not the same thing. And that's true, because this rise in debt was already happening before data colonialism. It's part of what we've been talking about already, which is neoliberalism. That's what Dr. Zhang was talking about, this intensification of market signals so that they become the main principle for organizing society. I like markets. I have no problem going to a market, buying things, and I buy things, buy a car, whatever. I clothes on markets. Markets are not the problem. The problem is when markets become the only principle for governing society, which is what neoliberalism is. And that fits very closely with data colonialism, because data colonialism is a way of governing society through data markets. The two fit together. They start different, but they are now converging together. So that's a good question. Thank you. You just mentioned blockchain, and this raises the fundamental environmental costs of the data processing in large servers. I don't remember the details, but basically I've heard that allowing blockchain to work for a day is like the electricity consumption of a big country like France. It's obvious that this is not sustainable, but it's still offered as a solution. So that's an example of ideology there being presented as business. And Dr. Dang mentioned the question of lithium, the batteries on which every device depends, including the servers. Well, again, this is not sustainable. So that's a big thing that has become even clearer since I gave that speech 3 years ago. But On the question of the solutions, I know Dr. Dang is an expert in the area of health, which is a very important area here because we all want more data about health. We need data to solve the pandemic. We need data to make vaccines. We know that. So data is not bad, clearly. But it's very important to have public control of the data, to use it for the social good. Everyone understands that. So what is happening right now? Well, most countries do not have control over the health data of their population. There is this proposal for data sovereignty, that nations should, as it were, have some influence over the data from their population, right? But where is the data being gathered at the moment? By large corporations linked to IBM, Google, Microsoft. The Wall Street Journal said that health data is the next great frontier. Those were their words, not mine. That's a colonial language. The next frontier is health data. So unless governments like in Vietnam, in South Africa, all over the world, Bangladesh, India, challenge the power of the global corporations to have control over the flow of health data, the risks are obvious that the future of populations will be in the control of corporations in the West. It will not lie closer to where the data comes from and where the decisions about health need to be made. So health is interesting because it's both an example where we do need data, but it's even more important that we control the terms on which we give up our data for the public good, not just for private profit. My colleague Ulysses has argued for national data sovereignty, but I think more as a challenge, a roadblock against corporate data sovereignty, at least the start of a conversation. But I agree with you that if we try to implement this, then it's problematic. First of all, because we don't always trust governments. It depends which country you live in. Do I trust the British government? Probably not. So that's a big problem for a start. And then the problem is all data is interconnected. This goes back to the issue of personal, individual data sovereignty. Some people argue each person should own their own data and then be free to sell it, right? Make a little money. Sounds nice. The problem is that the data that affects me is also the data that compares me with you. So it's not just my data. It's the data about you compared with me. So you can't divide data up in that simple way. And I think that's what you're pointing to is the deeper problem with ideas of sovereignty in relation to data. So you're right, this is complicated, but if politically, this is the only way we can challenge corporate power and start a conversation, maybe that's okay to start the conversation. Well, when I talk about social researchers, what I mean is that until recently, it was more common to celebrate Facebook and platforms amongst academics than to look at the questions we've been discussing today, which is a problem because these are real questions. That is changing, and that's good. We are starting to have this debate. I take your point. It's a very important one, that it's one thing for me in my privileged situation, living in the UK, with the resources I have to say there's a problem and that this is a major problem. And I'm not trying to lecture to other parts of the world and saying this is more important than what you think are the problems. And nor would Ulysses, being a Mexican, he wouldn't say that. What we're saying is that this is what we see as the direction of history. This is what marketers are planning. This is what corporations are planning. So we need to look at it and see whether all of us think this is good for humanity. We formed a network of Latin American scholars called Tierra Común, which is designed to encourage debate across the world. And I'm just sending you to the chat for everyone to see a link to an organization that Ulysses Mejias has started called the Non-Aligned Technology Movement, which is designed not to offer simple solutions from the West for the rest of the world, obviously not, but it's designed to encourage collaboration, listening to each other, to think about this problem for humanity, which, as Harari says, is the biggest problem for humanity in the 21st century. So every country should be part of this conversation. Every country has a right to be part of this conversation and to build connections and to understand how the problem is different in different places and to share ways forward and to share imagination. The main thing I'd say, Dr. Locke, as to why it's important to have this debate now is that if we're right, and this is the direction of history, then it will continue to be the direction of history unless we intervene very soon. We don't have much time. As happened in future, the direction of capitalism was set in the 1800s for the West, in the West, for the rest of the world. This is an opportunity to do things differently now and have a discussion that involves the whole world around these debates. But to do that, we have to get away from the dominant positions of the United States or China, which are dominating the debate before. So that's why I'm so pleased to have the conversation with you today about the particular situation of Vietnam. We need this with every country, but this non-aligned tech movement may interest in people. We're building resources through Wikipedia around this, and we're building conversations, and I and Ulysses will be very happy to hear from any of you with ideas about how we take this further. Because this is a very complicated situation. We are all gradually realizing this. So it's very hard to think, well, what do we do now? The best minds in the planet are worrying about this. Governments, lawyers, and so on are puzzled. I think the best I can say is this, that we want to imagine a different world where the collecting of data that makes a difference to our lives, good or bad, is under social control. It's data gathered according to our social wishes. It's collected according to our social wishes. It's developed, aggregated, processed according to what we know is happening and what we will want to happen. And it is used in ways that fit with what we want together as communities and as societies. That will be good, but it is very far from what we have at the moment. So all the talk about big data misses out the important things. Big data on what terms? Terms which have social control or people's control. I think that will be much better than what we are currently moving towards. And that's the debate we need to have right now.